remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law, while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. Amen. You may be seated. Today's message, I titled it, The Law and the Heart. The Law and the Heart. And I think it's something that I've been considering more often lately. I think it's something that is, if you know me, I've talked about it multiple times. I pretty much talk about it all the time. But it's the question of, why do you believe? Why do you believe? And not only why do you believe, but why do you choose to believe? Right? The reality is God has made a way for you to believe. He's given you new life in Christ. He's raised you from the dead. And now you're a new being in Christ. But there's still an aspect of us where we have to choose to believe. We have to choose to wake up on Sunday and go to church. We have to choose to read our Bibles. We have to choose to pray. And the question is, why do you choose to do that? As I've been reading the Sermon on the Mount every week, this is all that I've been reading. I've been reading the Sermon on the Mount as much as I can to just soak up what it is that Jesus is talking about. And the Sermon on the Mount, the more and more that I read it, is not just a sermon. It's not just Jesus going up a mountain and preaching and it sounding really great, although it is phenomenal. He's really exposing the human heart. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount, it should kind of leave you bare. It should kind of like make you consider like, man, why do I go to church? Why do I say I believe in these things? And why are these things important to me? And it doesn't just leave you there. It makes you ask the question, am I doing the things that Jesus has laid out on the Sermon on the Mount? Because, again, law and grace are not antithetical to one another. Law and grace actually go together. Okay? I think a lot of people think law is here and grace is here. It's not. They work in tandem together. So we really have to understand the law and grace and the heart. Because the better we understand the law, the better we're going to understand our own hearts. If we don't know the law, we don't know our own hearts. And half of the time, we do things based on the letter of the law, right? Why do we read our Bibles? We read our Bibles or we pray. Why? Because someone told me so. Or because it's the right thing to do. Because in my Christian walk, everybody keeps telling me if I don't pray or if I don't read my Bible, my Christian walk with Christ is not going to grow. Therefore, I read my Bible. Therefore, that's law. you still have not answered the question of, why do I spend time with Jesus? And if you read what Jesus is talking about in today's message, and specifically verses 22 to 26, Jesus is exposing the heart, which is why my two headings for today in verse 21, I wrote, Jesus confronts the law. And then in verse 22 to 26, Jesus exposes and explains the heart. The Christian faith is not an external religion. Biblical Christianity is not just a proclamation of certain historical events, although it is, and the gospel in and of itself is, and it's a historical event that actually happened, and it's the proclamation of a historical event, a historical person. It is not just simply a esoteric religion or some type of abstract thought. It is a presentation of historical truth, that there was a man named Jesus, that he lived a perfect life. He actually died on a cross, and he rose again from the dead. That is historical. And what we proclaim is not a fictional Jesus, but yet we present a true historical Jesus. And what Jesus does here in verse 21, he's now going after, or he's now confronting the law. And what you read, Jesus says in verse 21, you have heard that the ancients were told. If we just park it there, you have heard that the ancients were told. Who are the ancients? It was the people who had received the law, right? When Moses went up, he got the law, and he gave the 10 Commandments to his people, the Israelites. These people were told, which is why Jesus quotes the 10 Commandments, the 6th commandment, you shall not commit murder. He taught that to the Jews. And they know, okay, these 10 things are things that we should not do. And to this day, they hold the 10 Commandments as God's law, which is true. But when you read what Jesus is saying, he now elevates himself on equal parallel with the law. He's now saying, these are the things that I say to you, which is why it starts off in verse 22. But one of the things that we have to consider when we read these things, always you have to consider, is the context. Remember verse 17. 5:17 is the foundation for the Sermon on the Mount. You cannot understand the Sermon on the Mount without understanding 5:17. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Right? I didn't come to nullify or to take down the law, but rather I came here to deepen the understanding of the law. The law is not just simply do this, do that. The law is do this, do that. Why? Why are you doing these things? Why do you not murder? Why do you not steal? Why do you not covet? Why do you not do any of the things that I have told you in the law? Because when you think about the 10 Commandments, it's just a list of don't do these things because mommy and daddy said so. Right? That's kind of how we understand the 10 Commandments. We shouldn't do these things because God told us not to do it. But the question is why? Why should we not do these things? And when you read verse 21, Jesus is confronting specifically the Torah. He's going after this understanding of what the Pharisees and the scribes have built their whole religion upon. Right? These people, going back to verse 20, Jesus says, For I say to you that unless your righteousness that has been brought out, or your keeping of the law, of the Torah, your keeping of the Torah must surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees, or you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So that's what we're confronted by. Jesus is saying, you must keep the law, right? Because this is what God has instituted in the Old Testament. Do these things. Keep the 10 Commandments. And what have the Pharisees and the scribes taught? Do those things. Remember, the scribes and Pharisees were not evil people. They're the pastors of today, right? They're the people they're the rabbis who are telling their parishioners, their congregants, keep the law, right? This is what you need to do. And these people were doing the same thing. Please do not look at Pharisees and scribes in a bad way, because the people at that time did not look at them in a bad way. They were righteous, holy people. If you looked at them in a negative way, verse 20 would make no sense whatsoever. Right? So you have to look at scribes and Pharisees as righteous people. They were not unrighteous people. They were righteous. And what Jesus is saying is, your righteousness must exceed theirs. If all you're doing is going off based on your works. And that's the comparison that Jesus is saying, which is why in verse 21, he's now going to expose the heart of not only the Pharisees and the scribes, but over every person who actually thinks that I can earn my way to heaven. This is a monumental part of Jesus' sermon, because in verse 21, he is now going after the very religious framework that people thought, if I do this, if I keep this, I will be righteous before God. It's almost like us. If I read my Bible and if I pray, if I go to church, if I, serve at church, I'm in a righteous standing with God. God owes me this. If I serve the body, if I love other people, if I tithe and I give my offerings, I'm entitled to this. Nobody serves in the church more than me. Nobody does this. Nobody does that. But I've come in here and I've done all the things that the people don't want to do. God owes me this. You might not think that, but deep down inside, you might have something inside your heart that's saying, I've done these things. I'm in right standing with God. That's what he's exposing. And what Jesus says in verse 21, shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. This is a huge statement, because what Jesus says is, you will be held accountable. You will be held accountable for what you do. And the main reason that Jesus is going over this is because people had this mindset that all I have to do is keep the law. All I have to do is do X, Y, and Z. And what Jesus is constantly doing is, it's not that you shouldn't do those things. It's the fact that you think salvation is in the law. This is why Jesus elevates himself in verse 22, and he says, but I say to you. Right? Salvation is not in the keeping of the law. The law is there to break you and to show you that you can't keep it perfectly. But what are people going to do? People are going to mask it. People are going to say, I might not be perfect, but I'm better than so-and-so. I'm a better person than that person. That person says this thing, and he acts like this. I don't do that. That person says they're going to show up and they're going to help out, And last minute, they always bail. But I never bail. I'm a reliable person. I'm a good person. That person is not. And what Jesus is trying to tell us is, it's not about the law. Right? It's not about the law. The law does not save. The law reminds you that, yes, that other guy that you're talking about, what you're saying is all true. But it doesn't make you better. You're no better than that person. And that's why Jesus is constantly saying, he's constantly preaching law, and he's revealing what's inside of you so that you can understand the grace in which you stand. It's hard to understand grace if you don't understand law. The gospel is law and grace. What's the law aspect of the gospel? Everyone is a sinner. Everyone has died to the letter of the law. That is truth. Because nobody could fully attain the moral aspect of the law. No one could keep 100% every letter of the law. Morally and ethically, nobody can keep it. Which is why the law kills you. The law breaks you and suppresses you, and you're left there broken. Which is why when you look at the world, we're left broken. But that's where grace comes in. And it tells you you're broken. Which is why you have to put your trust in me. There is life in Christ. And when you start to look at the law, when you live your life long enough, you start to realize that there are things in this life that are unattainable. The more you live life, the more you start to see, wow, these things are really not my control. There are so many things that are outside of my control. And yet, these things happen somehow. I mean, I marvel at that. I marvel at the fact that I'm a married man. I marvel. You know, this week, I went up to my wife as I was reading the Sermon on the Mount, and my wife and I got into an argument. And I went up to her and I apologized to her for my actions. Because it's an amazing truth that God would allow me to be married. It's an amazing truth that God would allow me to have a wife and have my wife. Because I truly, in that sense, I truly don't deserve it. It's not something that I just say, but, you know, I joke about it. But to have a person next to me that fully supports me, even when I'm not fair to her. You know, if you think about that, like your wife or your husband in that sense is Christ to you. Because we don't deserve somebody to be good to us. We don't. Because sometimes the way we treat them, you have to wonder, why would this person want to stick around a person like this? If you just painted this person, if you put yourself in just a case study, and you wrote out the things that you did to this person, and the way you responded, and the way you acted, and you read this case study, and you evaluated this case study, you would think so-and-so, whoever is guilty or the person who is wrong, is a horrible person. Which is why we say things like, you know, the outside world says things like, Why are you still married? Why are you in a miserable marriage? You should leave that person and try to live the rest of your life happy. And can I just remind you, some people live their marriage and they're miserable. They're miserable in their marriage. Which is why it makes sense for unbelievers to say, why are you still married? Why are you unhappy? Go leave that person and try to find your happiness. And it almost makes sense. Right? Because what does that actually insinuate? What is that actually saying? That statement actually means there's nothing wrong with you. They're the problem. Therefore, leave the person and go live your life. But what does the gospel tell you? That they're not the problem. It's you. The issue is not with your spouse. It's internal with you. You're the cause for unhappiness. You're the reason why you're unhappy. And what the law tells you is, these are the reasons why you're unhappy. Because you do X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Why don't you fix that? And as you read the law, please read your 10 Commandments. Compare it with the Sermon on the Mount. See where you come short. And the moment you put yourself up there and you compare yourself with the standard that God has provided for you, you'll start to realize why you're not happy. And what Jesus confronts to us is probably the most practical thing in this life. And what is that? Anger. Anger. When I was a young kid, I grew up very angry. I was a very angry person. And I would say that there's still a part of me that's angry, which is why, when some of you guys first met me, I was very to the T. There is anger inside of me. But as I've gotten older, as I've read the Bible more and as I've contemplated the gospel and to think about my actions and to think about what is God trying to do with me, I've changed in that sense from anger to understanding that my anger doesn't change the situation. Me yelling or me getting upset, me raising my voice does not change the situation. Or does it make it easier for the other person to listen to what I have to say? Right? When we think about it, why do we yell when we get angry? Is it because we're thinking about the person, oh, the person didn't hear me, so I have to yell? No. That's not why we yell. Why do we elevate our voices? I mean, think about logically why you would yell. You yell because you're thinking, that person is far away, and they probably can't hear me, so I'm going to yell so that they would hear me. That's why we yell. But yet, when we get into a fight, we start yelling. And guess what? Usually, they're right in front of my face. When you think about the logical reasoning as to why we yell, it makes absolutely no sense. But when we think about why people yell, and you think about why you yell, why I yell, we start to realize it's an internal issue, right? Internally, what is going on? I'm combusting. I'm fuming. And the kettle, we can't keep the kettle down, right? And this is why, people lose it. And we start to say things and do things that absolutely make no sense. It is outside of our character. When the person looks at us and says, on an everyday, when this person is normal and not upset, this person does not act like this. This is an abnormal behavior. And yet, somehow, this type of behavior comes out. Why? Because what Jesus is saying. When you look at it in verse 22, Jesus now elevates murder to being angry. He says, he quotes the sixth commandment, you shall not commit murder. And he says, but I say to you that everyone who commits murder, right? That's what he says. No, he says, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Jesus, you were just talking about murdering. Why are you talking about being angry? Right? Think about what Jesus is saying. He's elevating murdering with being angry at somebody. And we think to ourselves, well, I'm a good person. I haven't murdered anybody. Well, you've been angry with somebody. And how do I know you've been angry? Because the moment you get confronted and the moment you have a debate with this person and you get upset and angry, what happens? You lose it. Why? Because there's anger inside of you towards that person. There is an animosity inside of you that wants to run through that person. You don't care how the other person thinks. You don't care how the other person feels. You just want to tell them how you feel and what makes you upset and why what they're doing is wrong. That's who we are as people. And when you read this, when you look at what you're doing externally, you'll start to think, as you read it, why am I doing this? Why am I saying these things? But guess what? That's already too late because you've already said these things. And the person that you said it to has already been burnt by this. But when you think about this, right? We say to ourselves that what Jesus is talking about in murdering something or somebody is so far from me. Because I would never do these things. But yet that's what we do all the time. One of the most interesting things about humanity, about mankind, is how fast we forgive ourselves. I think that's the most fascinating thing. Like, we'll do these things, and we'll play it off like it's not a big deal. And it's almost as if we expect other people to understand who we are as people, and we just expect them to accept it. And then we start to question, we ask them, why are you so upset? Are you okay? Why are you so upset? Well, I mean, can we just put it in logical terms? Like, if we got into a fight and you got burnt by the other person, think about it. If somebody got a burning pot of water and threw it at your face, would you go up to them an hour later and be like, are you okay? Why are you still upset about that? I mean, think about that logically. I mean, the fact is, you've just unloaded everything that is evil about you to another individual, and they're upset. You know, their facial expression is down. And then we have the audacity, because now I feel a little bit better. I thought about it. I cooled down. I go up to the person and say, hey, are you okay? You still look sad. Are you? I mean, can we just think about how ridiculous that actually sounds? And yet, that's how we all deal with it. Because now I'm okay. What do I expect? You to be okay. It doesn't make any sense. And yet, that's how we all work through it. And this is why when you read what Jesus is saying, what Jesus is saying is huge. Because now he's exposing your heart. He's going through, like, verse 22 is the highest point. Okay? 23, 24, 25, 26 is an explanation of verse 22. If you don't understand verse 22, read 23, 24, 25, and 26. Jesus unravels what he's actually saying, verse 22. If you don't understand what he's actually saying, verse 23. Therefore, if you're presenting your offering at the altar, okay, he's going to make it in simpler terms. What does it mean that you're angry with this person? What does it mean that you're angry and you're guilty before the court? Why are you angry and guilty? Because what does he say? He says, you good for nothing shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. He's going deeper and deeper into that understanding of what it means to be angry. Now you're saying things about the person. But what are you doing when you say you good for nothing? You're assuming that this person is useless. You're degrading this person. Despite who they are, you're insinuating and you're overriding who this person is based on your own bias. And not only that, he ends that statement and he says, whoever says you fool shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. This goes back to Psalm 14:1. Who is the fool? The fool is the person who says there is no God. What you're actually saying is, this person is a fool. He acts like this as if there is no God. And he acts like there is nobody who he is held accountable to. What you're actually saying when you call somebody a fool is you're saying this person doesn't believe in God. That person, the person who judges this person, that person is guilty enough to go to the fiery hell. What does that look like? What type of person would actually think these things about another person? It is the person who is offering something to God. Right? Because why? This person thinks nothing is wrong. I've blown up on this person. There's nothing wrong. I've said my piece. I've apologized to them. It should be okay. He says, therefore, if you're presenting your offering at the altar, then you remember your brother has something against you. Leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and present your offering. I think a lot of people have heard this. I've said it too. I've heard it through pastors who have preached this. I think a lot of people, I used to think that the highlight of this was the actual reality of people will walk up to 90 miles to Jerusalem because that's where the offerings were presented at Solomon's temple. So people come from all different areas to bring their offering, and they present it to God as an incense. And they offer it, and they walk this distance. So when Jesus is saying, present your offering, leave your offering there, walk back home, apologize to the person, and then come back, the severity of that, the trip, right? It's an astounding reality to leave your offering there, to walk back home 90 miles, to apologize to the person, to reconcile with the person, and to walk back and then present your offering. I thought it was an amazing idea of having to walk that distance, because that's what it means to truly be committed. I don't believe that now. I think that is a radical thing to do, but I don't think that's the point of what Jesus is actually saying. What Jesus is actually saying here goes beyond that. It goes beyond the fact of walking 90 miles, right? Because there was a song back in the 90s. I don't know if you would know that song, but I would walk 100 miles, okay? Look at David. He's cringing. But for all of you guys who are old enough to actually listen to that song, you should listen to it after. But I think the point that Jesus is making here is in verse 23. When you're presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you. I think that's the essence of what Jesus is talking about. Right? Because when you get into a fight with another person, like let's just put it easy. I'll just put it in marriage terms. If I get into a fight with my wife and I act like nothing is wrong, and I know she's upset, I know for a fact that she's upset, and I'm trying to pray, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Because I know my wife is still upset. But what am I trying to do? Trying to feel better about myself by praying to God and asking for forgiveness and doing these things. But notice what he says. He says, when you're trying to present your offering at the altar, you're trying to go to God, draw near to God, and there remember that your brother has something against you. Notice that. Remember that your brother has something against you. What does that actually mean? There is a thorn inside of your heart right now. You still know that your wife is not fully recovered from that. That there is a weightiness to your heart. You know something is wrong. That's the essence of what Jesus is talking about. How would the Jews have understood this? Because Jesus is bringing up this topic of offering. Jesus, why are you talking about offering? And that's what I was thinking about. Why is Jesus talking about bringing an offering? What does that have to do anything with verse 22? So I started to look into it. If you read the Talmud is a primary source of Jewish religious law and Jewish theology. In the Talmud, when you talk about offering, they talk about something called karbanot. I probably butchered the Hebrew, okay? But in karbanot, it's a Hebrew word that literally means sacrifice or offerings. And it comes from the root word karban, okay? So the root word in Hebrew, karban, actually means to draw close. So when you bring an offering, you're drawing close, okay? And there's three basic important concepts of karbanot. The first aspect of that is the aspect of giving. You give an offering because you're renunciating this idea of something that belongs to me. Okay, so when you give this offering, you're saying, I renunciate what I'm offering to this person, right? It's kind of like Leviticus 1, where in Leviticus 1, in the atoning system, you would get an offering, you would touch its head, and you would renunciate your sin and give it your sin away to this animal, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. The second concept is this element of substitution. The idea here in karbanot is that the offering that you're making on behalf at the temple or at the altar, you're offering these things because you realize that what is being offered, whether it's a burnt offering or like when you see how Jesus is talking about like offerings and you read the Old Testament about the different type of offerings, you're understanding that what is happening to your offering is what should be done to you. So when you think about a burnt offering, when the Jewish people offered burnt offerings, what they're actually understanding through Karbanot is that should be done to me. Okay? The last aspect of this offering is not just simply, I leave it there, I understand that it should be done to me, but the last concept is, through this offering, I'm coming closer to God. Okay? I'm doing these things because I want to be closer to God. When you think about these principles, it's the same thing as to why we do communion. It's the same thing when we talk about the doctrine of salvation. When you think about the gospel, right? You think about penal substitution. We talk about a vicarious penal substitution. We talk about the imputation of righteousness. Some pastors will talk about triple imputation. Some pastors will talk about double imputation. Regardless, we talk about imputation. What do we mean by imputation? We impute, we relinquish our sin to Christ. We give it to him. And what does Jesus do back to us? He gives us his righteousness. We give him his sin, he gives us his righteousness. Some people call that what? The beautiful exchange. There was a beautiful exchange at the cross. We gave him our sin, he called us righteous. Where do we get that? 2 Corinthians 5:21. Right? When we think about this whole idea of Karbanot is the whole essence of what the gospel actually teaches. But I want to highlight what Jesus is talking about. When you offer up your offering, when you understand that these are the things that should be done to you, understand that first, before you offer your offering, because of the sin that you know you have committed, before you understand that these are the things that should be done to you, go first and reconcile yourself with your brother. Please do not understand, please do not miss how important that is. Why is it important that you first reconcile with your brother? Why? Why is it so important that we reconcile with one another? Because anger grows in us. One of the things that I've realized, I've been making it a habit, a good habit, I would say. I've been making it a habit to ask my wife when I do something wrong, I've been asking her, can you forgive me? One of the things that I learned from that lesson of asking for forgiveness rather than saying I'm sorry is there's a positive aspect to me. I'm humbling myself and asking for her mercy. But you know why it's even more important as to why we ask other people for forgiveness? The great lesson that I've been learning is it teaches the other person how to forgive. I realized one of the big things about asking for forgiveness versus me saying I'm sorry, when you say you're sorry, what are you actually saying? When you say I'm sorry, what you're saying is, I'm sorry, now you have to figure it out as to how you're going to forgive me. You have to work through it yourself. And you have to dig down deep and forgive me. And that's wholly on you. But when I ask you for forgiveness, and I ask you, can you forgive me? I'm helping you to forgive me. I'm letting you process inside what it is that you're angry with me about and what it is that I've done. And I'm telling you, these are the things that I've done wrong to you. Can you please forgive me for these things? And you say, can you forgive me for these things? What you're allowing the other person to do is understand, okay, this person actually understands why I'm mad, why I'm upset, to the degree that I'm upset. And this person wants to walk with me to help me forgive you. That's reconciliation. Reconciliation is not simply me saying, hey, I'm sorry, you try to figure it out. Which is why what happens most of the time. After you apologize, the person still looks upset. Why? Because they haven't been able to work through it yet. But when I say, I'm sorry for this, can you please forgive me? What you're allowing the other person to do is to actually forgive you, to actually work with you in tandem to reconcile the issue at hand. And when we learn about, and why did I think about that? Because when Jesus says reconcile is two people working at it. That's how the Hebrew defines it. Reconciliation doesn't happen with just one person. Think about the gospel. When we say we have been reconciled to God, what happened? Is it one person doing everything? The reality is what? When we think about the gospel and we say we have been reconciled to God, did God literally do nothing and wait for us? God sent his son to die a shameful death on your behalf. And he reconciled us to God. Does that mean now I sit there and I do nothing? I ask him for forgiveness. Can you please forgive me? Can you please forgive me? I want to do these things. Can I please live my life in such a way that would be pleasing unto you? If you think about the third concept of what the Jewish people are doing when they're offering their offerings, they're trying to draw close to God. This is the Christian life. Why do we do communion? Because I want to think deeply about weighty things about my own sin. I want to recognize my own sin and bring it upon the altar of God and say, Lord, please forgive me for this. Because I can't forgive myself. I need forgiveness for this. And what do we talk about? God has already forgiven you. Through Christ's finished work on the cross. But that last concept, when we offer to God, do you really have inside of your heart the desire to be closer to him? That's the motivation. The motivation to the Christian life is not just simply XYZ, I execute XYZ. Inside your heart, do you have a desire to be closer to God? Is the reason why you keep the law because of your desire to please God. It's not just keeping things. It's not just a bullet list of things that I need to do. Are you keeping it because of your profound love for God? And if you think about it, what Jesus is saying is, up to verse 26, all he's doing is he's talking about the importance of reconciliation. And he's talking about why you need to reconcile. Not only because you're going to get thrown into jail, because there's going to be a punishment, there's going to be you being held accountable. But more than that, you're going to have to live with these people for the rest of your life. Do you really want to live your life angry with other people? Because you don't want to reconcile. You want to stay angry. And I love verse 25. Make friends quickly with your opponent. Notice that. That person no longer has a grudge against you. Why? Because you fully worked out everything that was bothering that person, and you've reconciled that person. That person is no longer someone who's against you. That person is now your ally. When you think about these principles, and you think about how practical in the way in which Christ is preaching, it helps you to understand, as Christians, going back to what it means to be salt and light in this world. This is what sticks out with people. Right? Like, if we're the same with everybody else, we look the same, we act the same, we talk the same, we live the same, what does Jesus say? He says, it is no longer for anything else except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. The essence of the Christian life is knowing why I do these things. Why I live this way. And then living this way. Please, do not think Christianity is about doing things. It's not about reading your Bible. It's not about praying. The question is why? Why? And the more you understand that question of why, the more you understand God's grace. But if you just do the things, you're going to face burnout. That's natural. You're going to burn out. You're just going to be like, I'm tired of doing this. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of this. If that's how your heart feels, then all you've been doing is keeping the law. That's all you've been doing your whole life, your whole Christian life. It's always been about law, 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 law. But this is why Jesus is constantly saying to you, you have to understand why you're doing these things, why you're trying to keep the law. And I want to remind all of you, service in the church is great. Service is great. But you have to know why you're doing it. And the biggest thing here, the biggest takeaway here in what Jesus is preaching, when you're serving in the church, you have to forgive. Right? We have to learn how to forgive. Because what do when we don't forgive? We hold people to a certain viewpoint. We say, this person is like this, and this. And they're never going to change. And what happens? We become bitter and angry with people. And what Jesus is saying here is, you need to forgive. There has to be some type of sacrifice on your behalf where you have to learn to forgive these people. Why? because of the forgiveness that you have received in Christ. Without forgiveness, you can't build a marriage. Without forgiveness, you can't build a friendship. Without forgiveness, you certainly can't build a church. And I want to constantly remind us, right? If there is no unity in the church, it's because there is no forgiveness. You can't build anything without forgiving one another. And I just want to remind us on how practical it is. You know, this is what Jesus is constantly telling us. It's your heart. You have to be able to look at your heart and to diagnose your heart correctly. So as we think about this, I pray that all of us would be reminded, and if we do have anger or bitterness towards somebody, ask them for forgiveness. And you'd be surprised as to how forgiving people are willing to be.